So, welcome to our Romantasy talk with Jenna. Super excited to have her here. And we're going to talk about Jenna's new book. But before we do that, let's just show her Savior's Champion. My own copy of her book. So, Jenna, guess what? Is the author of Savior's Champion, best-selling author. But what we're here to talk about today is how to write a romantasy. So, very exciting. My copy arrived about a week ago. I got a special copy, which I'm very thrilled about. And so Jenna is an expert in this area. She knows everything there is to know about romantasy. She knows how to write. We use her work in our courses because it's so good. So we're really, really thrilled to have Jenna here today. So Jenna, I'm going to pass it over to you and you can just let her rip and talk romantasy. Oh, one question. Do you want people to ask questions during or after you're talking?
I probably won't be able to answer them until after,
Okay.
just for the whole sake of not, losing my train of thought. But they're welcome to send them during, and then I'd be happy to go through. But I probably won't answer until after.
Fantastic. And I will manage the chat for you. You just sit back,
Cool.
relax, and talk romantasy.
Awesome. And I did see that someone asked, "Is Butters coming?" And I can say, here
Oh,
she's here.
that's the
She's
most important question. Of
It's
course.
funny because I used to be like, oh no, well, Butters is with me every time I film YouTube content. So sh anytime I come in here, she's like, I'm ready. Like it's just she's used to it. And I used to do interviews and stuff and be like, oh, I'll leave Butters, in the other room, and she'll cry. And then people started being like, "Where's Butters?" Like they get upset. So now I feel like I have to bring her, but she doesn't mind. I don't mind. But everyone always asks, "Where's Butters?" So it's like we're a package deal at this point. So she will be having. Jessica says I'm a Butters fangirl. Yeah, she will be having a nap. Thank you, Butters. She will be having a nap during the presentation, and every once in a while she'll poke her head up to make herself known.
Just so we know
Um,
she's there. That's very
yeah,
important.
she's like, I'm the real star here. She's like, little known fact is she wrote all the books, and I'm just speaking. She just
Just
slams her paws on the keyboards.
there's
She's the real
magic in
writer.
Jenna's worlds. Magic. Okay, write a book.
Yeah, exactly. So she'll be here, and if you hear any weird growls or anything, I promise nothing strange is going on. It's just my dog.
It's just Hubbard.
But anywho, let me go ahead and share my screen. And we're going to talk about romantasy, my favorite topic, especially these days. But anywho, thank you so much for having me. Like Christina said, my name is Jenna Moreci. I am a #1 Amazon award-winning author of romantasy books. You can check out my series, the Savior series. I have the third book coming out in the Savior series in February, so that's very, very exciting. And I just released How to Write Romantasy yesterday, so I'm very tired. I have lots of coffee, so that's how things are going right now. But I'm here to give you kind of the basics for how to write romantasy, just where to get started. There's a lot of misconceptions about the genre. There's a lot of confusion, especially thanks to non-experts on Reddit getting everything all messed up. So we're going to cover all the basics, basically how to get started with the genre, how to make sure you're writing a romantasy and not something else, and all that good stuff. So we're going to start with the most obvious question. What is romantasy? Again, like I said, a lot of people are very confused about this. There are people who say romantasy is a fantasy novel with a romantic subplot. I've seen very, very weird, interpretations of the term, but romantasy is actually very simple. It's more or less a novel that's half fantasy, half romance. I like to say that it is a romance novel set in a fantasy setting or world. But in order to better understand this, it's a good idea to sort of understand the genres that make up romantasy. Believe it or not, a lot of people don't understand what fantasy is, and a lot of people don't understand what romance is. So we're going to break down its parts so that we can better understand how to write a romantasy novel. So let's start with the fantasy genre. Okay, fantasy is speculative fiction. And it means that you're following a story that either takes place in a fantasy world, like King's Landing or something like that. Or it's a novel that features magic and magical creatures, like we see in Percy Jackson, we see centaurs and all that good stuff. Or it's both. So, for example, you could have a fantasy story that takes place in a fantasy world, but there's no magic. An example of this would be Ithacanna from the Bridge Kingdom. That's still fantasy. Even though there's no magic, there's no magical creatures, it's still a fantasy world, so it counts. Then there are stories that take place in our world. Maybe it takes place in San Francisco, but there are elves living, in the Painted Ladies. That's still fantasy because elves are fantasy creatures. Or maybe there aren't fantasy creatures, but the characters have magical powers. They have elemental magic in San Francisco. That would still be considered fantasy. Now, if you combine all of these things, a great example would be Lord of the Rings. We've got a fantasy location, the Shire. We've got magical creatures, we've got Smeagol and Frodo and all those guys. And we've got magic, we've got wizards and all that good stuff. That would obviously be considered fantasy. So you can absolutely include all of it, but you don't necessarily have to. Now we are moving on to romance, and this is a genre that is probably one of the simplest, easiest to explain genres out there, but it's probably the one that people get confused about the most. So, a romance novel is a story that focuses on the romantic love and relationship between two or more people. They want to be together, but something is throwing a wrench in their love. They almost don't end up together, but by the end, they're in a happy relationship, and the ending has to be either what's known as a happily ever after or a happy for now. This is the part that gets a lot of people confused. They think that a romance novel just follows a romantic relationship and that's it. No, for it to be considered a romance, it has to end in a happily ever after or a happy for now. A lot of people go, but Jenna, what about Romeo and Juliet? Joke's on you, Romeo and Juliet wasn't a romance. It was actually a tragedy. Or more specifically, a romantic tragedy. Just because a book or a play or a movie follows a romantic relationship, it does not mean it's a romance. Contrary to popular belief, a lot of Nicholas Sparks novels are actually considered love stories and not romance novels because we're following a romantic relationship, but sometimes one of them dies at the end or something like that. So yes, a book can totally follow a romantic relationship and have it end tragically or end with them broken up. You just wouldn't be able to label it as a romance. So again, I'm going to hammer that home. You got to have them happy together at the end. So again, like I said, romantasy is a combination of these two things. It is usually a romantic relationship that is struggling and they're trying to go against the odds, but they end up happily ever after or happy together within a fantasy setting. And we will elaborate on this a little bit more later on. Now, if I could emphasize one thing, and if there's one thing that you take away from this, Romantasy is not a fantasy novel with a romantic subplot. That's probably one of the biggest misconceptions about the Romantasy genre. And it's really important to get this hammered home because a lot of people write fantasy novels with romantic subplots and they market it as Romantasy. And it's really easy to understand why. Romantasy is a booming genre right now. So they think, I want to get all those readers. I want to get them on board. And, those are very pure, honest intentions, but the problem is you're marketing the wrong product to them. So they're going to read the book, realize it's not a romantasy, and you're just going to get dive bombed with one-star reviews. You're just going to get a bunch of people who are really upset because you didn't deliver on the promise. So if you're not sure what the difference is, a fantasy novel with a romantic subplot is a fantasy novel, usually some kind of fantastical adventure, maybe some type of quest. Usually they're fighting against a big baddie, but along the way, two or more characters happen to fall in love. It may enhance the plot or make the story more interesting, but it's not the substance of the plot. At the end of the day, if you were to remove that romantic relationship, you might have to cut a couple of scenes. It might be a little less exciting, but the story could still be told. Frodo could still destroy the ring. Everything would be fine. With a romantasy novel, the romance is the plot. It makes up at least 50% of the plot. It's the substance of the story. So if you were to remove the romance, the story would cease to exist. It would be a new book entirely. So that's how you're able to tell the difference. Some people do well with examples, so I'm here to provide one. Let's take a look at the difference between a romantasy novel and a fantasy with a romantic subplot. I'm going to use my book, The Savior's Champion, as an example. When we reduce the Savior's Champion to its barest bones, this is a story about a guy named Tobias, his family's struggling financially, and he doesn't know what to do about it. So he enters this bloody gladiatorial tournament called the Sovereign's Tournament. It's where a bunch of dudes are fighting and killing each other to win the hand of a holy queen. He enters this tournament, and unfortunately, he's supposed to be falling in love with this holy queen. He ends up falling in love with her sister. So now, not only is he in this violent tournament and he has to try and survive, he has to try and survive and not win the queen, which is nearly impossible. He's trying to survive and escape with the woman he loves and have both of them escape the tournament and just be free and safe together. Again, this is a story that follows a deadly tournament where this man is in love with someone else. That is the premise. If I were to remove the romance from this novel, it's a totally different story. I mean, the closest equivalent would be Gladiator, a guy in a tournament killing a bunch of people. I could tell that story if I wanted to, but it's a totally different book. It would require me to rewrite at least 75% of the book. So again, this is why it's a romantasy novel. If I remove the romantic relationship from it, the whole conflict of the novel dissolves, the whole premise dissolves, the ending dissolves, all of the juicy rising action disappears. So that's how you know it's a romance or a romantasy. The romance is intrinsic to the plot itself. So let's take a look at what's not romantasy. And I really love to use the book Ashes by Iona Wayland as an example because it's the absolute perfect example. Ashes is a dark fantasy novel that has a romantic subplot. And it follows a woman named Angela who recently tragically lost her brother. And she learns from a psychic that her brother is not at rest in the afterlife. He's actually in extreme turmoil. And there's only one way to put her brother at rest. She needs to sprinkle his ashes in a very specific part of the magical hollow forest. Excuse me. The problem is the Hollow Forest is filled with deadly monsters and magical creatures, so she has to try and survive this forest. Along the way, she obviously eventually decides to go to the Hollow Forest. She meets a mentor in the forest who helps guide her through the forest, and now she has to find a way to survive the forest and survive the monsters and find that exact place to scatter her brother's ashes. I think we can see the difference between this and the Savior's Champion, how this isn't a romantasy. I just explained the whole plot to you, and I didn't mention romance once. Well, what happens is as I mentioned, Angela has a mentor. She happens to fall in love with the mentor. And that's great. That was my favorite part of the book. I absolutely loved it. But it wasn't the premise of the story. The story was all about Angela and her relationship with her deceased brother. If we removed the mentor from the book entirely, Iona would have to rewrite a few scenes. It would be harder for Angela to get through the Hollow Forest, but it wouldn't be impossible to tell her story. Even if we kept the mentor but removed the romantic relationship, maybe they just became really good friends throughout the story. Yes, it would be less interesting, but Angela could still scatter those ashes. Her romantic relationship was not pivotal to the plot moving forward. So that's how you can tell that it is just a subplot and not a romantasy novel, is if you were to remove that element, the story could still be told totally fine. And to be clear, these are both valid courses of action to take. It's totally valid if you want to write a fantasy novel with a romantic subplot. It's totally valid if you want to write a romantasy. The key here is just to make sure that you're marketing it correctly so that the right people pick up the book, or if people love both genres, they go in with the correct expectations. All right. So we covered romantasy. I wish it was as simple as that. Unfortunately, we writers, we like to make things super complicated. So there are different types of romantasy. Specifically, there are two types of romantasy. There is fantasy romance and there is romantic fantasy. Do they sound virtually like the exact same thing? Of course they do. Are they virtually the same thing? Yes. Do they need to be divided into separate categories? No. But here we are, they exist. So I'm going to break down the difference between fantasy romance and romantic fantasy. So let's start with fantasy romance. Fantasy romance is a type of romantasy that has slightly more emphasis on the romance versus the fantasy. I like to say the book is 60% romance and 40% fantasy, roughly. You can usually tell if you're reading a fantasy romance because there are going to be multiple scenes focusing on the emotional and potentially physical connection between the quote unquote ship between the main characters who are falling in love. Usually, if we're looking at a book like this, their romantic relationship might start sooner than in some other romantasy books. I like to say usually you can see it starting within the 1/3 mark of the book. Maybe it's through a kiss or through them confessing feelings for one another. Either way, there's going to be more of an emphasis on their romantic connection. Great examples of this, if you want to study the difference, is Blood Mercy by Vella Roth. She loads her books up with lots of really swoon-worthy romantic scenes. It's super fun to read. And then, of course, The Savior's Champion by yours truly. My characters, you start to be able to see that they're falling in love with each other, or at least they're developing feelings for each other by the feelings confession, I believe, starts at chapter 7. So it's pretty early on in the book. Next, we have romantic fantasy, which is the inverse of fantasy romance. This is a romantasy novel that's going to have slightly more emphasis on the fantasy than the romance. I like to say that it's 60% fantasy and 40% romance. You can usually tell if you're dealing with a romantic fantasy because the romance is going to be slower burn, which basically means that it takes longer for the characters to admit their feelings for one another or for them to get together in some kind of physical or romantic sense. This is the genre of choice for a lot of enemies to lovers because you need them to hate each other for a long time before they finally hook up. You're also going to see romantic fantasies a lot for writers who want to do extensive world building. If you want to elaborate on governments, politics, a climate, things like that. Obviously, those things can be present in fantasy romance, but they're there to usually act as a supporting cast to the romance, whereas in romantic fantasy, it's going to take a little bit more of a center stage. Another way you can tell if you're dealing with a romantic fantasy is usually the characters get together later in the book. So I don't want to spoil anything, but the Bridge Kingdom's been out for a really long time. So using that as an example, the characters don't really confess their feelings until right before the climax of the novel, which is like 70% of the way through the book. So that's usually how you can tell that you're dealing with a romantic fantasy as well instead of a fantasy romance. Great examples of this, like I said, are The Bridge Kingdom by Danielle L. Jensen and Blood and Steel by Helen Shoira. But the one thing that I want to emphasize here is that both fantasy romance and romantic fantasy are within the romantasy umbrella. They both count as romantasy. They are just different flavors of it. Personally, I think that it would have just been simpler to just stick with one term. We have people all over Reddit and all over the internet fighting of, no, this is what this means, and this is what this means. But basically, romantic fantasy and fantasy romance, they're both romantasy. They both count. They're just slightly different and they have slightly different flavors. So if you're more of a fantasy fan, you'd probably prefer romantic fantasy. If you're more of a romance fan, you'd probably prefer fantasy romance. Okay, so let's say that you have a romantasy idea and you don't know where to start. I always start with what I call the thought dumping phase, which is where you just take all of your ideas and throw them in a Word document, throw them in a notes app on your phone, throw them in a notebook, just any idea. You don't have to organize it. You don't have to put it in chronological order. Just get your ideas out there. And once you have all those ideas out, try to build a conflict from those ideas. You guys may already know this, but stories revolve around plot, and plots hinge on conflict. There is some type of problem in your main character's life that they are trying to resolve. This is probably the easiest part of the writing process once you let go of the need to be original and unique and a special writer. Obviously, all of us writers, we want to be original and unique. The conflict is not the place to do that. If you look at every single genre of fiction, if we look at the mystery genre, all mystery novels have the same conflict at their core. There is a mystery, usually a murder, that needs to be solved, and your main character is going to solve it. If you look at the romance genre, every single romance novel has the same conflict. Two or more characters are falling in love, but uh-oh, they don't know if they can make it work. Will they make it work? If you go through every genre, you are going to see the same one or two conflicts pop up. And so when you're crafting romantasy, this is no different. As diverse and unique and special as this genre is, all romantasy novels at their most simplest core, they have the same conflict. And like I said, this is not the place to complicate it. You can make your story special through the characters, through the setting, through the themes, through the nuances, and through the rising action. But the conflict is always going to be the same. The standard romantasy conflict is something fantastical is threatening to destroy your main character's love. Again, you might be wanting to argue and be like, well, what about this book? What about that book? We're going to break them down right now so that I can show you they all have the same conflict when you strip away all the interesting doodads. So we're going to start with my book, The Savior's Champion, once again. As I already covered, The Savior's Champion follows Tobias entering a deadly tournament. And again, there's depth to the story. We've got different character arcs. We have studying, analyzing mental illness. We have grief and, lots of layers. But when it comes to the conflict of the story is actually very simple. A fantastical, deadly tournament is threatening to destroy Tobias's forbidden love with Layla. The story follows Tobias. He's forced to enter this deadly tournament to win the heart of a magical queen, but he falls in love with her sister Layla. So now he has to escape this tournament with her. When you look at it at its bare bones, it's a fantastical element, the tournament, that's threatening to destroy their love. So let's take a look at another romantasy novel that is very different from The Savior's Champion, and that's The Bridge Kingdom. We have the character Princess Lara. She has been set up in an arranged marriage to King Arin of Ithacana. And she goes off, she marries this guy she's never met before. But what he doesn't know is she's secretly an assassin tasked to overthrow Ithacana. The problem is now she's living with King Arin and he's pretty hot. He's beefy, he's sexy, and he's nice. He's not what she expected. And she's actually starting to develop feelings for him, which makes overthrowing the kingdom a lot more difficult. So again, we strip all of the nuances of this story away. Okay, what is the conflict? A rivalry between fantastical kingdoms is threatening to destroy Lara's unexpected love. These stories are very different, but they have the exact same conflict at the root of the story. And again, you might be thinking, oh, but like these are just two books. Like they're all of them. They can't all follow this. I've read a lot of romantasy books. I'm sure there's an exception. I've yet to find it. And again, these stories are very different from one another. A lot of people wouldn't even consider them comp titles. The Savior's Champion's a fantasy romance. The Bridge Kingdom's a romantic fantasy. The Savior's Champion is filled with magic. The Bridge Kingdom doesn't have any magic. The Savior's Champion is a forbidden love story. The Bridge Kingdom is enemies to lovers. These stories are very different. They have different writing styles. They have different influences. That doesn't change the fact that the conflict underneath it all is still the same. So when you're going to start your romantasy novel, just take a look at what fantastical element can be wedged between these main characters' love story and build from there. It's the building that you do that can make these stories really unique and really stand out from everyone else in the genre. So now we're going to take a look at structure. This is something that a lot of newbie writers struggle with. They just think, I'm just going to write all the scenes I want to write. I'm going to write some battles. I'm going to write people making out. I'm going to write people having sex, and I'm just going to throw it together. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. Novels require structure. And we're going to see that pretty much every novel has the same bare bones structure. It's referred to as Freytag's pyramid, which is where every novel starts with a beginning, it has a rising action, which is where stuff starts to get crazy and things are happening. We have a climax, which is where whatever problem the main character is dealing with comes to a head. We have a falling action, which is where sort of the pieces all line up and everything gets sorted out. And then we have the resolution, which is where the problem is solved. Romantasy is no different. It has its own structure. Similar to the Romantasy genre as a whole, its structure is a combination of the fantasy structure and the romance structure sort of mushed together. So we're going to break down the fantasy structure and the romance structure separately and see how you can combine them to create a Romantasy structure. So here we go. This is the standard structure for the average fantasy novel. I put this disclaimer at the bottom. Stories vary. Not every fantasy novel will follow this to a T, but this is just the general concept of a fantasy structure. We start with the beginning of Freytag's pyramid. Usually at the beginning of a fantasy novel, a problem is introduced. Something is wrong in the main character's life or the main character's world, and they don't know what to do about it. This problem leads to what's known as the inciting incident. And the inciting incident is when the main character either decides to take action against the problem or is forced to take action against the problem. So say the problem is that the main character's dad is dying of some very rare magical affliction. And the inciting incident is when they embark on their quest to get a healing amulet to save their father. That's what the beginning of a fantasy novel would look like. The rising action is exactly what it sounds like. It's a series of action that just sort of rises in intensity and pressure. It basically is the series of wins and losses as the main character tries to resolve whatever their problem is. In the case of the example we're using, it might be that the main character is trying to find this amulet, and along the way they get kidnapped by a witch, or along the way they have to battle a warlock or something like that. You're usually going to see a series of blunders before they start getting their stride and start experiencing some success. And then right before the climax, we're going to experience the dark night of the soul. I like to call it the breaking point. It's usually a big failure where the main character starts to lose hope that they're going to solve their problem. The climax is when the problem is faced head on. Maybe the amulet is guarded by a dragon and the main character fights that dragon. Usually, at some point in the climax, they almost fail, but then they rally and they succeed. He gets that amulet. We're all good. The falling action is when the pieces kind of come together. If there are any lingering questions, they are answered. In this case, it might be him heading home with the amulet and figuring out how to use it. The resolution is when the main character solves their problem, and in a fantasy novel, it's usually when they reflect on how this journey has changed them. So in this case, he brings the amulet to his father and he looks back and thought, you know what, I used to think that I was just kind of a weak dude, but now I'm a warrior and look at how far I've come. Next, we have the romance structure, which again, still follows Freytag's pyramid, still looks the same, but it's just different facets are included in, the beginning, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. So at the beginning of the romance novel, we have what is known as the meet cute. This is when the main character meets their love interest. I guess I understand why it's called the meet cute, because sometimes it can be a cute experience, but usually it goes horribly wrong. Usually one or more character embarrasses themselves. Oftentimes they get started off on the wrong foot and they don't like each other. But ultimately, by the end of the meet cute, they need to leave the situation feeling like, oh, romance is impossible with this person, or romance is the furthest thing from their mind. The rising action, similar to with a fantasy novel, is usually a series of blunders that are building in intensity. Um, there's going to be a lot of romantic tension between the main character and their love interest. There's going to be, maybe situations where they almost get together, but someone walks in the room, or they almost get together, but one of the characters totally humiliates themselves. You're going to see a lot of will they or won't they moments. But at some point during the rising action, they get together. How you interpret that is up to you as the author. It could be they finally kiss. It could be they're finally dating. It could be they have sex. It's up to you how you interpret that. But after they get together, at some point, there is going to again be a dark night of the soul. It's going to be some kind of separation. It might be a big fight. It might be a breakup. It might be a miscommunication. It could be that one of them just leaves the country. Something happens to separate them in some way, and it makes them feel like, oh, I don't know if this relationship is going to work. Then we have the climax. In a romance novel, I like to call this the grand gesture, where one or more character decides, I'm going to fight for this love. And they do something big in order to make that happen. Usually we'll see some kind of fumble or we think, oh, it's not going to work. But then they rally at the end. The perfect, most cliche example of this is if one character is going on an airplane and they think they almost missed the plane, you know? We can use Ross and Rachel as an example. Ross missed the plane to go see Rachel, and then all of a sudden she goes, I got off the plane. And we find out that she got off the plane, he can still make his grand gesture. So that's the most cliche example, but it's a really good example to illustrate this point. The falling action is when the pieces come together and questions are answered. If there's a miscommunication, they communicate at this point, and the resolution is the happily ever after. They are now in a happy relationship together. So now we combine these structures in order to create a romantasy novel. And it may seem really complicated, and like how do you mush two genres together? But believe it or not, fantasy and romance actually pair really well together, and it's a lot easier than you think. The beginning is probably the most mushed together because you need a problem, an inciting incident, and a meet cute somewhere at the beginning. It's up to you if you want the inciting incident or the meet cute to come first. It could be, you know, the meet cute goes before the inciting incident. It could happen at the same time. An example of this is the Bridge Kingdom. The meet cute and the inciting incident are when Princess Lara and King Arin are married. It's the first time they're meeting and it starts the conflict. So, you know, you could have them happen at the same time. You could have one go before the other. The big thing is the problem needs to be introduced first. That is always the first thing that's going to come up. You usually introduce that in the very first chapter. So long as the problem goes first, you're good to go. The rising action is going to be your characters trying to resolve their problem, and at the same time, they're dealing with this growing romantic tension. Maybe your characters are working toward the same problem, and that's why they're stuck together and they're feeling this romantic tension. Maybe they're at odds. Maybe it's enemies to lovers, and they each have their own goal and they keep butting heads. Maybe they're just happen to be in the same setting at the same time and they keep bumping into each other. The idea is they are going to have a series of blunders and a series of wins toward resolving the problem while this romantic tension is growing. At some point, they are going to get together. Again, your definition of get together will vary. But ultimately, before the climax, they're going to experience what is known as the dark night of the soul or the breaking point, which is where they are separated, they lose hope in their relationship or in resolving their problem, and just everything feels like a giant mess. The climax is going to include the problem being faced head on, as well as a grand gesture. The grand gesture can come before, during, or after the climax, but it's usually going to be in that vicinity. A really easy example of this is if the problem being faced involves a big battle and your hero yells across the battlefield, Princess, whatever, I love you. You know, that's a grand gesture. They are pausing in the middle of, you know, death-defying odds to confess their love. That's how we kind of combined the, you know, climax, the action of the moment with the grand gesture. It doesn't have to be a flash mob or, you know, something elaborate. It could be as simple as finally saying, I love you. The falling action is when the pieces come together, questions are answered. This is especially relevant in romantasy because we usually have things like hidden identities, we have things like betrayals. A lot of stuff needs to be communicated. And the resolution is when the problem is solved and there is a happily ever after or happy for now. Now, a lot of people hear this and they get really worried because they decided that at the end of book one of their series, the characters are going to be broken up. That's fine. So long as the characters are together by the end of the series, you're okay. So all the books within the series, can be them broken up. Maybe you pull an ACOTAR and your character has one boyfriend in book one, goes to a new boyfriend in book two. That's totally fine. So long as you get that happily ever after by the end of the series. If you want to end one of the books mid-series in a tragic way, for example, instead of at the climax they have a big win, maybe the climax is a huge failure or betrayal, then I like to say when you get from the dark night of the soul and then moving on from that, sort of do the antithesis of every point on Freytag's pyramid. Instead of a dark night of the soul, I like to say a bright day of the soul. Have them reach a moment of pure happiness right before the climax, because the climax is going to be a supreme failure. So you want it to feel like the exact opposite. So again, spoilers here, but in the Bridge Kingdom, the characters, bright day of the soul is them finally getting together. They're finally in love, they're really, really happy together. And then the climax is when everything goes to hell. The kingdom is destroyed, all that horrible stuff. And the book ends with them, estranged from one another, but Princess Lara is determined to make things right. That's how you would sort of flip this Freytag's Pyramid if you're writing that sort of ending for a mid-series book. Just know that by the end of the series, you're going to want to use this particular format because they got to be happy and in love at the end. So next we're going to discuss everyone's favorite part of romantasy, and that's the power couple. This advice also goes for thruples and reverse harems and all that good stuff. I'm just going to be using the term couple to keep things simple. But basically, a power couple means characters who are better together, characters who get stuff done together, because ultimately your characters are probably battling dragons and evil warlords. You want them to be more successful when they're together. And this is going to make readers root for the relationship, which is ultimately what you want. You want them to be invested in the relationship. So I spend a buttload of chapters talking about how to do this in immense detail in How to Write Romantasy, but I'm just going to touch on what I think is probably the most important thing to figure out, which is how to craft characters who would realistically be a power couple. It's not enough to just be like, I'm going to give him a six-pack, or I'm going to give her big boobs. Like it's not enough to just make the characters hot and then smush them together and say kiss. You need to craft characters who would realistically have chemistry with one another. And there are three components to making this happen. The first is to make the characters complements, which means that they are essentially like puzzle pieces that fit perfectly together. Like I said, they are better when they're together. A really obvious example of this is to make one of them an introvert and the other one an extrovert. Maybe the extrovert brings the introvert out of their shell. Maybe it makes them feel like they can be a little bit more daring and they can do the impossible. Maybe the introvert provides a sense of calm and peace for the extrovert. The introvert gives the extrovert a place where they can just be vulnerable and feel heard and seen. Again, the reason making them compliments is such an asset to you as an author is because it's going to make the characters more entertaining on the page together. You're going to be able to write these characters showing sides of themselves that they haven't shown already to the reader. This is going to be interesting to the reader, and the reader is going to want to see them on the page together more often. That's what you want because the characters are falling in love, so they should be on the page together very often. The next thing is to make them equals. This always gets authors really nervous because they're like, well, I wanted to make her like this supreme powerful goddess, and he's just like a lowly farm boy. I'm not saying they have to be equally powerful. They don't have to be equally intelligent. They don't have to be equally hot. I'm not saying they should be the same. I'm saying that they should bring an equal amount of benefits and an equal amount of baggage to the relationship, okay? So when you're crafting these characters, the easiest way to do it is to tick off how many strengths does this character have? Their love interest should have just as many strengths. For every positive trait that character A has, character B needs to have a positive trait. The same goes for negative traits. If, character A is a big liar, then character B needs to have an equal and comparable negative trait as well. And the reason we do this is to avoid what I call the Twilight curse. Um, Twilight was obviously a very popular story and people loved it. But outside of sort of the younger crowd, sorry, I feel like I'm gonna sneeze. It'll come eventually. But outside of the younger crowd, the biggest criticism that Twilight got, well, among other things, was the romance itself. A lot of people felt like Edward and Jacob were written to, I mean, they were very toxic and dysfunctional, but they were written to be very sexy and very desirable, whereas Bella kind of came across as lame. She just seemed kind of boring. She was very passive. She didn't have any agency. So a lot of readers were like, what even, I mean, there's a whole other argument here of, well, these guys are toxic and need therapy. But there, a lot of people were saying, what do they see in her? Why are they interested in her? You don't want that to be the question that readers have while they're reading your romance. So that's why we want to give them an equal amount of benefits and an equal amount of baggage. The inverse of the Twilight curse is something that we see in a lot of adult romances where the woman just seems like, and again, this also applies to queer romances. I just see this particular problem more often in straight romances. We'll see a woman who's like really great and she's got her stuff together and she falls in love with a guy who's got more problems than a run over dog and she's got the nurse curse and she's just trying to heal him, you know? A lot of people are like, what does she see in him? He doesn't need a girlfriend, he needs therapy, you know? You're trying to avoid that problem by giving them an equal amount of benefits and baggage right at the get-go so one character doesn't seem supremely out of the other character's league. It'll get readers way more invested in the relationship and it'll get them to not, worry about this issue. The last thing is giving them common ground. Give them something deep to bond over. They don't have to be the same. They don't have to have similar backgrounds, but give them some kind of vulnerability that they can relate to for one another. An example I like to give is maybe one character is really worried about their mother. Maybe she's ill and they feel like they have to take care of their mom and they're never doing enough. And maybe the other character has to take care of a kingdom and they feel like they're never doing enough. Obviously, a mom and a kingdom are very different things, but they both have that vulnerable feeling of, I feel like I can't do enough for this person. And they're able to bond over that on a deeper level. This is important to the story because it gives these characters a moment to be vulnerable. It gives these characters a safe space that they can vent to one another. They can show a different side of themselves. And as much as readers love the sexy times or they love the kissing and the flirting, these vulnerable moments are key to making readers believe that these characters could really fall in love. It's some of the most powerful moments you could include in your story. And the reason you want these three components is they build emotional intimacy between the characters. Like I said, it's going to be a lot more believable for them to fall in love. And this is what's going to get readers believing their relationship and rooting in them getting together. Now we're going to take a quick look at romantasy subgenres. There, you have a lot of room to play with when it comes to romantasy. Not everything needs to be exactly like ACOTAR. Not everything needs to be like Blood and Steel. You've got tons of different subgenres to choose from, and I'm just going to list a few of the more popular ones right now. First, we have epic romantasy. This is what most people think of when they hear the word romantasy. It is a romantasy story set in a fantastical world like Thesson from The Savior's Champion or Ithaca from the Bridge Kingdom. Usually the characters travel across multiple realms, and sometimes the books tend to be a little bit beefier. This is sort of, like I said, the standard romantasy. If you're writing romantasy and it falls into the epic category, usually don't need to let people know because they're going to assume that's what it is. But if you wanted to, you can throw the word epic in there so they know, hey, it's going to be in a fictional world and they're going to travel. Next, we have contemporary romantasy, which means that the story takes place in our world or a fictional town within our world, but it has fantastical elements. So like I said before, it could be the story takes place in San Francisco, but we're following an elf who lives in San Francisco. Or maybe the story takes place in the fictional town of Meadow Grove, but Meadow Grove is in Idaho, something like that. That's how you know it's a contemporary romantasy because it exists in a contemporary location. Next, we have cozy romantasy. I recently interviewed a cozy romantasy author, Casey Blair, and she had the perfect definition for cozy romantasy. Cozy romantasy means the stakes are local. In epic romantasy, it's usually the fate of the world is on the character's shoulders. Are we going to save the kingdom? are we going to save the world? In cozy romantasy, it's, are we going to save the bookshop? Are we going to save the village? The stakes are a lot closer to home. They're a lot more intimate. Some people can say that they are lower stakes. They are going to feel like lower stakes to the reader, in the grand scheme of things, but to the characters, it still feels like a really big deal. Um, but again, it's going to be something like, I have to save my father's inn, or I have to, save the town. It's going to be local stakes. And we're going to have lots of cozy moments, like maybe sipping tea or, knitting or something like that. We've got cutesy moments thrown in there. Next, we have dark romance. I can't bring up dark romance without bringing up dark fantasy because a lot of people confuse these two and they are very different things. So I'm going to start with dark fantasy. Dark fantasy means that the setting itself, the world that the characters live in, is dark. It has elements of dread and gore and horror. Bad things are happening in the world. A great example of this is The Savior's Champion, which is a dark fantasy romance. The world is a deadly tournament where people are dying left and right. There's lots of gore in the book. I describe a person being set on fire. The prologue is a woman getting her throat slit. Like it's really gory and graphic. That's what a dark fantasy is. The world is dark. A dark romance is the opposite. The world could be San Francisco. It could be Chicago. It could be, beautiful butterfly town. I don't know. That's not what makes the story dark. The romance itself is dark. The romance is maybe dysfunctional. It's a little bit twisted. The romance will include elements like stalking or kidnapping or serial killers. And that's not to say the main characters are being stalked and or being chased by a serial killer. I mean, the main character falls in love with a stalker. They fall in love with a serial killer. They fall in love with their kidnapper. Sometimes we have things like dubious consent. So the darkness of the story takes place in the romance itself. So the love between the two or more characters is a little bit twisted. Next, we have gaslamp romantasy. I like to say gaslamp is to fantasy. Excuse me, my asthma is all messed up. Hold on one second. There we go. I like to say Gaslamp is to fantasy as steampunk is to sci-fi. So basically, the story takes place in an Edwardian or Victorian style era, but there's magic involved and, there's magical creatures. So maybe your main character is a witch or a sorceress, but she also wears a hoop skirt, So it's that sort of vibe. It can be very, very fun to write. And next we have paranormal romance. Paranormal romance isn't a subgenre of romantasy, but I like to say it's kind of like its cousin. Basically, paranormal romance is a romance story involving spooky paranormal creatures like ghosts, werewolves, cryptids, vampires, all that good stuff. A lot of people get confused because you could include those in romantasy if you wanted to. So a romantasy novel could have ghosts, it could have werewolves, it could have vampires. That's totally fine. Usually what separates paranormal romance from romantasy is how these creatures are employed. So if you have a magical vampire who has, magic and is doing fantastical things, that's usually going to go more the romantasy side. An example of this would be Twilight. Paranormal romance are if the characters are behaving in a spooky, goes bump in the night sort of way, where it's more of a feeling of fear. That's when we look at paranormal romance. And again, obviously there's a very fine line between this. This is when you're going to want to consult beta readers, critique partners, editors, see where they feel like which camp they feel like your book falls into. And that's all we got today. I cover a lot more of this in How to Write Romantasy. This is just the tip of the iceberg. But these are the starting points to look at if you are interested in writing romantasy and you want to nail the basics and just have an idea of how to move forward.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jenna. Awesome. I took like a whole page of notes here. It's all cool. Even though I've already read your book. It's so nice just to see the clarity and the it brought up to a high level of making it really clear. So that was fantastic. So we have a few questions. So I'm going to go straight to those since we're 9 minutes before the hour here. So we're going to go.
Sorry.
It's all good. It's all good.
Okay.
We're going to go to Kelty first. And she says, if you're writing a romantasy trilogy, is it okay if the end of the book one is not HEA or HFN, but the last book in the series is? I think you
Yes,
answered
that's
that.
That's totally fine. That's very common. It's also common, like some people, like for example, spoiler, the book's been out a long time, whatever. At the end of the Savior's Champion, the characters are happy in their relationship. So there's a happy for now, pretty much. They're happily in love. You can do that in a mid-series book, but something needs to be still messed up. So the fantastical problem in the Savior's Champion is still very much a problem, but their relationship is happy. So that part is good. The world around them is still very bad. So if you wanted to, you could end a mid-series book with them happy together. But if you wanted to, they could be totally broken up. The example I give is the Bridge Kingdom. At the end of the Bridge Kingdom, the king hates the princess and the princess wants to win him back. So you absolutely can do that so long as they're together by the end of the series.
Nice. All right, Lauren says, I want to write a series in which the first book is a true romantasy, the second book is fantasy with romantic subplot, and the third book is fantasy without romance at all. Could this be a problem?
It could potentially, I mean, I understand the impulse because if you got an idea, like you want to go for it, it could potentially be a problem in for marketing. It's one of those things. It's hard to say because I'm all for like if you're passionate about the story, write it. You're just going to have to be as clear as possible with readers that it's kind of going to edge out of the romance as the series progresses. I personally, to avoid that issue, might start from the very beginning marketing it as a fantasy with a romantic subplot just to get readers, prepared. Um, hmm. Fantasy reader, well, I'm trying to think of a way to word this. It'll be easier to get it'll be easier to get people on board with a romantasy if you market it as fantasy with a romantic subplot versus if you marketed something as a romantasy and it just had a romantic subplot. Does that make sense? So, um, if it were me, I might just market the series as fantasy with a romantic subplot. Um, or you could just try and like shout it from the rooftops with every book, like, okay, this is the genre for this book. It's just one of those things where it can be difficult because sometimes readers are stupid, sometimes they don't pay attention, and sometimes you could market it perfectly and you're still going to get people like my books are romantasy. I've had people leave one-star reviews saying there's too much romance in this book. And it's like, well, it is a romance. So I don't know. That's like reading Twilight and going, there's too many vampires in this book. It's like, well, it's a vampire book. So what were you expecting? You're going to get some idiots no matter what. But I think if you market it as clearly as possible, like that's the best you can do.
That's funny. Okay, Sherry says, in a romantasy series, can the ratio of romance to fantasy vary from book to book? Example, book one has more romance scenes than fantasy scenes, book two, vice versa, essentially sliding romantic fantasy to fantasy romance. So it's kind of a twist on the
Yeah.
question just asked by Lauren.
I think so. And it's a little bit easier if you're just bumping back and forth from fantasy romance to romantic fantasy because they're virtually the same thing. They're like pretty much the same thing. The fact that they have different titles to me is silly. I think it's totally fine. You might have a few complaints because there's always someone. For example, in one romantic fantasy series I saw, as the series progresses, it gets a little bit more romantic. So I saw a couple people complain, there's too much sex in this book. And it's just like, well, like just because there's like two extra sex scenes, it's like, get over it, guys. There was sex in the first book. So you might have a few complainers, but fantasy romance and romantic fantasy are so similar that I just feel like there's no way you're going to have the exact same amount per book. Like you can't ratio that. No one is going through and counting the percentages or counting this many pages were devoted to romance and this many pages were devoted to fantasy. It's all just ballpark estimates. So I would say you're fine. And anyone who's being that nitpicky, you wouldn't be able to please them anyway.
So I gotta say, there are people who go through and count because I'm one of those people,
Oh no!
but only when I'm studying books and I'm trying to understand why it's
Yeah,
so
I do that
good.
when I'm studying, but not when
When
I'm
I'm
trying to help
not when I'm
people.
reading
Yeah,
it, but when I'm
yeah.
studying a book to go, okay, this book is fantastic. Why? I'm always counting. Well, how much do they do here, and how much? So there are people, but I don't post
Yeah.
pictures on that. That's just me studying.
No, I mean, like when I'm studying, I do the same thing. But if I'm just reading something for fun, I'm not there like, okay, how many pages of romance is there? How many? I'm not doing that, you know. I might get it. Like, for example, I read The Bridge Kingdom, obviously, and I knew that I would say the book was like 70% fantasy and 30% romance. Like, but that's a rough estimate. Like, I didn't actually count the pages. I could be, maybe it's 67% fantasy, and like I don't know the exact page numbers.
Okay. Liz says, very new to writing. Just curious who or what entity created and defined the subgenres.
I have no idea. My theory is that someone just started smushing the words together, and because it originally was just fantasy romance, which is normal. There's sci-fi romance, there's romantic thrillers. It's normal to write multi-genre books. I would argue most books are multi-genre in some way. Even The Lord of the Rings could be considered a epic fantasy adventure. Most books are multi-genre in some way. So when I released The Savior's Champion, romantasy wasn't a term. So I was just marketing it as a fantasy romance or a dark fantasy romance. It's just, I think it's just kind of fun to smush words together. I've heard people call their sci-fi romance books sci-fi mance. Um, I've heard of dystopomance as well, dystopian romance. I think somewhere along the line, people just started smushing the words together and it caught on. I,
Yep. And
that's my theory, at least.
part of it too is you as the author need to know what you're writing.
Hmm.
And then there's the marketing side of how it's being marketed. And they can
Hmm.
be very different. And when we look at the mystery genre, for example, there's so many books out there labeled as a mystery and think, and that's a thriller. And there's tons labeled as thrillers, and that's a mystery, right? And
Right.
so the marketing side, the publishers can do funky things with it, and then these new terms come up, and it's always changing, right?
Hmm.
So it's more important to know what you're writing, what are you writing to, and keep your book focused on that than it is to be, I've got to meet this trend or that trend. And sometimes terms are defined, particularly in books, terms will be defined so that you're using the same knowledge when you're looking at the rest of the theory in the book. There could be five different ways this thing is defined. You Google on the internet, you get this and this and this, but when you're doing it for a book, it's important, like Jenna's done, to go, here are my definitions. So when she's talking through the book, you get what she's talking about. It's not confusing. So don't get hung up on it, I guess is my
Right. And that's the thing is, at the end of the day, I'm always telling people it's not that serious, it's not that deep, and people think that what I'm saying is these are frivolous genres. That's not what I mean. I mean storytelling in general is supposed to be fun. If you're writing a mystery, if you're writing romantasy, if you're writing a thriller, whatever, we're doing this because we enjoy it, and we also probably have a story that we want to
yeah,
tell, and that story has depth. But I think a lot of people sometimes take the process too seriously, and it's like, lighten up. We're essentially playing make believe. It's
right.
fun.
Exactly. Lighten up and be
Hmm.
kind. Okay, we're going to do one more question from Magali and then we're
Okay.
going to cut it off. So Magali says, in the case of an epic fantasy series with romantic subplot, I'd love how everybody's so knowledgeable about this. This is essential that the main plot's goal, would it be considered romantasy if the romance is essential? There's a lot of emphasis on the fantasy setting, but the romance is slowly built over the course of the books in my series. Or is it best to stay away from fantasy and say it's a fantasy with romantic subplot? Whew, that was quite the question.
So you have a couple of options here. And again, this comes down to gauging reader expectations because sometimes readers can be nasty. If it's, first of all, I would look at your conflict and see if does the conflict boil down to X fantasy element is threatening their love. And again, like all stories are more complicated than that, but I mean at its most bare bones, the simplest version of the conflict is that what the story's about. And if this is a yes, then I would say it fits a romantasy. In terms of how you market it, it's going to depend on a few factors. I've seen it one of two ways. You could either market it as a fantasy with a romantic subplot that then builds into a romantasy as the series progresses, or you could market it as an extremely slow burn romantasy. Um, I've seen authors do it both ways. I haven't been in that situation, so I can't tell you which way is better for the market. But I've like, for example, there's one author that I've seen where literally the only thing that happens is one kiss between the main character in the first and their love interest in the first book toward the end. It's like literally like at the climax, they kiss once and that's it. And then as the series progresses, they're going to get more and more romantic and eventually become in a relationship and sleep together and things like that. And they're marketing it as an extremely slow burn romantasy. And they're telling people if you want a true slow burn where it's going to take books for them to get together, this is your book. But again, the other option is to say it's a fantasy with a romantic subplot. And then as the series progresses, say, guess what, guys? Now it's a romantasy. I wish I could tell you which way works better. I don't have the personal research for it, but those are your two options.
Okay, thank you, Jenna. That was fantastic. You always cram so much in an hour. I love when you come to Fictionary and talk to us. Um,
Thank you.
Really super exciting. I put your book link there again for anyone who doesn't have it yet. If you're at
Thank
this
you.
presentation, clearly you're interested in Romantasy. It is an awesome read. I've read every word already, so
Thank
highly
you.
recommend it. And yeah, Jenna, thank you.
Thank you. And thanks from Butters, who slept through the whole thing. Tough crowd. But I really, really appreciate you having us here today. I always enjoy talking with Fictionary and talking with you. It's always a blast.
Fantastic. Well, good luck with this book, and hopefully we
Thank
get you back
you.
when your next book comes out.
Yes, that would be amazing.
All righty. Bye, everyone.